Welcome back everyone to the Organic Archery YouTube channel. Today's video is the first chapter in a 6-part arrow making masterclass. So we're going to start today with the easiest way of making arrows, which is from store-bought dowels, because they're very inexpensive and they're already shaped. But there are some things to consider with store-bought dowels, which we'll cover today. And then as the chapters progress, so will the difficulty. So chapter 1 is arrows from store-bought dowels. Chapter 2 will be arrows from split timber or boards, which are hand-planed on a very old jig known as a shooting board. Chapter 3 will be river cane or bamboo arrows. Chapter 4 will be the most difficult of all, which is wild shoot arrows from natural materials found out in the environment. So for the first, 4 chapters, it's just going to be how to prepare the arrow shafts for points and fletching from various materials. And then we'll move on to chapter 5, which will show different styles of fletching. I'll probably cover at least 3 or 4 different styles. And then chapter 6 will be mainly focused on how to handcraft your own hunting broadheads from recycled tool steel. So if you're seeing this in real time, just hang tight because I'm going to film the entire series as quickly as I'm reasonably able. But if you're watching this sometime in the future, obviously you'll be able to skip right to whichever chapters are most pertinent to you. So before we get started, I wanted to touch on a couple of very important points when it comes to arrow making. From my findings through snooping around on the internet forums and reading the archery texts that are out there, it often seems like arrows are kind of an afterthought. People put a great amount of effort into crafting their bow, and then when it comes to arrows, they're just like, hey, I need some arrows. I'm going to source them inexpensively or hastily put a set together. But it's important to know that arrows are actually as difficult or more difficult to make than a wooden stick bow. And there is an ancient Native American proverb that says, any old stick makes a bow, but good arrows are a heap of work. And I would say, in my experience, that is 100% true. So one other fun fact is historically, especially during militarized archery periods when massive quantities of bows and arrows were being made, you would have a master bowyer who you go to for your bows and master fletchers who you go to for your arrows. And nowadays, every bowyer is kind of just expected to also be a fletcher. And at this point in my bow making career and arrow making, because I do consider myself a fletcher, I have made thousands of arrows and they have become the bane of my existence pretty much. It's not that they're unenjoyable to make, but when you're making hundreds per year, it really just becomes kind of monotonous, and it is a ton of work, and it's very hard to charge for the amount of time that goes into a well-made set of arrows. I have to make so many arrows that I am mostly interested in making them fast and good. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of cresting your arrows and painting them with beautiful decorations and going all out with them, by all means, go for it. But at this point, I consider arrows to be expendable, and I break a lot of them by shooting the nocks off or shooting at wild game. So I don't want to have emotional damage every time I lose an arrow, because even to make them good and simple takes a colossal amount of work. So when you start tacking on the extra hours to doing the cresting and all the fancy designs and everything, it can really break your heart when you lose one of those in the woods. I've made several dozen arrows with stone tools, and it's just not something I'm interested in anymore. So if you're looking for a stone tool build, move on to the next video. We're going to be using modern steel equipment. It's all reasonable equipment. Some of it, especially during the split timber chapter, will be power tools. But throughout the series, I'm going to show you very basic hand tools, and I'll also show you some of the luxury tools. And if you have disposable income, those are things that you can look into that will greatly speed up the process while maintaining the quality. I make my way over to the local hardware store's dowel section, and I'm looking for the 48-inch long 3/8 poplar dowels. And you can see here they're very inexpensive, but we'll talk about the benefits of a 48-inch over a 36-inch dowel, as well as the benefits of 3/8 over 5/16. You can also use other wood species, but oak, for example, is extremely heavy. I usually sort through the entire stack of dowels, and I'm mostly looking for perfectly straight grain that runs parallel down the arrow from end to end, with as little grain run out as possible. Here's a set of arrows with perfect grain. Notice how it runs all the way down the length of the arrow with very little grain run out. This is what you're searching for when you're sorting through the dowels, and you want to get as close to this grain orientation as possible. You'll usually find some that are close to perfect, like this one. You can see it has a couple of runouts along its entire length, but this is still within acceptable limits, and I would take it. Here's a poplar dowel at the store with almost perfect grain, but you can see it has a couple of runouts, and I'm going to set this one in the maybe pile for now. Here are two examples of absolute no-goes. You can see the extreme grain runout in the one closest to the camera, and the other has a pin knot with tear-outs. With grain runout this severe, this arrow would likely shear in half as soon as it was shot from a powerful bow, and those grain chevrons create sharp spears that could badly injure your hand or wrist. So no matter how desperate you are for arrows, anything that looks like this needs to go back into the rack immediately. I sorted through the pile quickly and found 13 maybes that will now get a much more thorough inspection. I'll spend a little time with each of these, looking them over carefully. You can hold it up into the light if you can't see the grain well, and I'm separating them into yeses and nos, and you'll see that only about 50 to 60% of the original batch make the cut. All right, so we're back in the shop with the 8 dowels that were air quotes perfect from the hardware store. And actually, now that I'm back here in much brighter light, I can see one that has really bad tear out in the grain, and I didn't see that when I was in the store. So we'll see if I can cut that off. That's why it's great to do the 4-foot dowels, because oftentimes you will see grain that's perfect for, say, 30 to 36 inches, and then in that last foot or so it dives off and gets a bunch of grain run out. So by going with the 4-foot dowels as opposed to the 3-foot dowels, you've got an entire foot of extra material, and so you can plan out which excess you're going to cut off to get the best quality arrow shaft. So I'll see if I can get this one with tear out cut down to length so that it's a non-issue. You can also see in one of these, I don't know if the camera will be able to focus, but there's a pin knot right there. In my opinion, pin knots are a no-go with arrows. You really want to be strict with your arrow grain orientation, even more so than with a board bow. And the reason is because if you have an arrow shaft with too much grain run out and a powerful hunting weight bow, if that arrow shaft snaps, it could definitely impale you in the wrist or the hand. And so it can be quite dangerous to have an arrow break upon release. If you are questioning it at all, just put it back. It should be either a definite yes or a no. You can also see why it's so important to select more material than you think you're going to need. So if you want a half a dozen arrows, it's definitely wise to get, say, 8 or 10. And if you want a dozen arrows, it's wiser to get, say, 15 or more arrow shafts while you're at the store. You'll see that as a recurring theme throughout the chapters, that we're taking just a little bit more material than we actually need, with the expectation, or I mean possibly really even a guarantee, that some of those arrow shafts are not going to make the cut. So don't compromise on your arrows. It's important for safety and durability. Anyway, let's get into preparing arrow shafts from store-bought dowels. I'm starting with an initial length of 36 inches, and that's going to give me plenty of material to account for the natural waste and adjustments that happen during the arrow making process. You want to choose the end with the straightest grain, and if you have any irregularities like run out or pin knots, put those on the end that'll be cut off. And of course you can trim it from both ends if the best grain is in the center of the dowel and you have problems on both ends. You can see the benefits of the 48-inch length unfolding in real time. If you had a 36-inch dowel, you wouldn't have much room for adjustments. One of the easiest ways to cut wooden arrows without power tools is to score them deeply with a knife all the way around and then snap them off. Whenever I'm doing a big batch, I will just bundle them together and cut them all at once on the miter saw. Here they are, cut to their initial length with the best grain carefully selected. If you saved one of the ends with a sticker on it, go ahead and remove that. It's pretty common for them to be quite crooked, so let's fix that. I like to straighten wooden arrows by hand by sighting down them and applying pressure to the outside of the bends with my palm. And when you're sighting down them like this, the crooks are clearly visible. It just takes a little bit of practice to learn how much pressure you can apply. And you might even break some arrows in the beginning. But in my opinion, if they can't survive a mild straightening process, they were probably never meant to be shot from a bow anyway. A couple of the problems you have with dowels is there's very little control over the manufacturing process. So if you have a handful of dowels from the store, let's say 6 arrows, there's a high chance that that's from 6 different trees in 6 different locations. So for you to expect to get a perfectly weight and spine match set from a handful of store-bought dowels, to me, is a bit of a waste of time. It's probably better to consider a dowel a practice arrow, so you can, learn the art of arrow making, or a disposable arrow. Maybe you build up a big batch and just sling them at small game or whatever, high risk shots. Small game usually has trees and rocks involved, and you don't want to shoot your best set of arrows at small game. So dowels are great small game arrows. They're incredibly durable. I can actually notice as I'm straightening these, some of them are physically lighter and weaker in spine quite noticeably. So that's another reason we go with 3/8 dowels and not 5/16, is because even if you have a light spine in a 3/8 arrow shaft, it's probably still going to be well within the safety margin, like 55 to 60 pounds plus in spine. Kind of an issue that you'll probably run into more frequently with 3/8 dowels is they'll be severely overspined. Some of these that I'm straightening right now are definitely in the 80, 90 plus spine range. So try not to get too much in the weeds. I think you would double or triple the time investment to try to make a match set of dowels, and you probably still wouldn't succeed. So just practice with these. We'll get into the more like finely matched sets as the chapters go on. This step is optional, but I do think it makes them a little higher quality. During the manufacturing process on a lot of these, there's a ridge that's formed, and they're kind of a little bit out of round. Maybe they have some mild irregularities. I don't know if they're run through like a router system. I don't know how industrial dowels are made, but you get a little higher quality product if you chuck the dowel into a high-speed drill and run it through a little bit of sandpaper to make it perfectly round. That's why it's important to straighten these early on in the process, because if you chuck these up into a high-speed drill and it's got a bunch of wiggles in it and you get to spinning this thing, it could just snap the shaft. So take a little bit of time to make sure it spins pretty true and doesn't have a lot of whip. And that's one of the reasons we leave these extra long to begin with, is because I'm gonna damage, you know, an inch of the shaft here by crushing it into the drill chuck. So straight out the gate, smoothing out the shaft, I went from a 36 inch to now a 35 inch because I'll have to cut off the crushed portion. I have a little 120 sandpaper here. That's usually plenty aggressive. I got a glove on my sandpaper hand so I don't get burned by the friction. And so I've got the little piece of sandpaper folded in half, so I've got good grip on both sides. I'm just gonna spin it real fast. I'll usually do about 2 to 3 passes up and down and then check it. And that was enough. It is perfectly round. The arrow shaft that had the grain tear outs, I was able to eliminate that by cutting it off the end. But this one has some sort of like dent in it right here. It actually just looks like it was kind of undercut by whatever machinery made it. This arrow shaft is very, very stiff. It's one of the higher spined ones. So I'm gonna correct this little divot by taking a little bit of material off the entire arrow shaft, or an even amount of material rather. Okay, after a few more passes, I was able to get rid of the damaged area, and fortunately, this was one of the higher spined arrows, so it still feels very stiff even after removing that material. If you were to fix an area, a problem area, and give the arrow a flex and it feels drastically weaker, it's best to just dispose of it. Don't risk it. And determining the spine by feel comes with a little bit of experience, but over time you'll be able to tell quite easily, you know, that it's dropped too much spine. So this one turned out fine. I don't know if the camera can pick this up. I've got it in the sun to give you guys the best chance of seeing it, but with 120 grit, when it comes off the drill, it'll have a spiral sanding pattern on the entire arrow shaft. And this is not a necessary step, but it does make the arrow look much nicer, and it makes it a lot smoother and slicker, which is important for penetration on big game, for example. So Same 120 sandpaper. Just plant your hand on a stationary surface and run the arrow shaft through a few times and you'll get a much nicer finished product. Now all those spirals are gone and it's nice and smooth, and I'll hit this with a finer grit sandpaper here shortly. But let's do all these in 120 first. The ends are pretty rough from trimming and from the factory, so I like to tidy them up.
Very nice.
Okay, one of the most important steps in arrow making with timber is the orientation of the nocks in relation to the grain. So you can see this arrow shaft has grain that runs this direction. So you would never want to cut your nock parallel to the grain. So if I was to center this and cut my nock parallel to the grain, it would have a significantly increased risk of splitting the arrow shaft because the wood's grain is going to want to split naturally along its annual growth rings. So to make your nocks very strong, you always cut perpendicular to the growth rings. This is a critical step in the durability and safety of your arrows. I brought one pine shaft over here to show you a better visual. You would never cut your nock in this direction. You would cut it perpendicular to the grain. So here's a quick overview of the tools I like to use for carving nocks. The first is just a generic hacksaw blade with a little scrap piece of buckskin on here for comfort. I like to use a single blade wide. You'll see in a lot of arrow making tutorials, people recommend, stacking 2 or 3 blades together, and that method works fine. But I like a single width blade, and I'm only using this to create the pilot cut for the rod saw so that it runs more true. The rod saw is just a hacksaw frame with a rod saw or tile saw blade. Often the names are used interchangeably, but a rod saw is just a long wire basically with some very aggressive sandpaper on it. Next is a triangle file that I got at the local hardware store for under 10 bucks, and it's got a homemade handle on it. Next is a needle file or a rat tail file, and I think this handle is just an old arrow shaft. Lastly, a little piece of 120 sandpaper for fine tuning the opening of the nocks. I personally like to use a vise to hold the arrow more secure, and because it makes it faster for me to do large quantities of arrows, but definitely feel free to use whatever freehand method you come up with. So it's going to be relatively important, not critical by any means, but aesthetically important for you to make sure the notch gets cut the same depth every time. One method would be just to measure down about 3/8 of an inch and make yourself a pencil mark on each one of the arrows so you know how deep to go. But this particular brand of hacksaw blade I use has a bit of red paint on it, and over time it gets worn into a paint line here. And so I just know that if I cut up until the paint touches the top of the nock. I'm 3/8 depth, and also I'm making every one of them exactly the same. I'm just going to use the hacksaw blade to create a perfectly straight pilot cut for the rod saw to follow. One of the more critical steps about your nocks, I would say number one most critical would be that it's perpendicular to the grain. Number two most critical step is that it's cut straight down the arrow shaft. If you have nocks that are cut crooked in the arrow shaft, it will definitely affect your arrow flight. And then number three, most important, a distant third would be that they're all the same depth, but that's more aesthetic than anything. So it comes with a little bit of practice to make these things perfectly straight, but it is very important. And that's another good reason why we leave the arrows 36 inches, so that if you cut your nock crooked, you can just cut it off and keep retrying until you get it straight. Now the rod saw will open this up to a little bit less than the diameter of a standard sized B55 or D97 bowstring. Nice and straight, right down the center of the arrow shaft. Don't worry about those little abnormalities. The rod saw is very aggressive, so it leaves little, weird marks in the nock, but we'll tidy that up with some sandpaper. Yeah, I'll just show you guys a couple in real time so you can see how quickly it goes with practice. But I like to do all of the arrows through the hacksaw and the rod saw before I move on to the next step, because the next few steps happen at a different station. This one ended up just a little bit too crooked, but fortunately the arrow is still 36 inches long, so I'm just going to grind it off and cut it again. Much better. Now I'm just going to take the 120 sandpaper and clean up the rod saw marks a little bit. Nice and even and clean. Now the nocks will work as is, but I'm gonna open them up on the top so they register on the string a little quicker and make them a little more beautiful. To open up the top of the nock, I switch to the triangle file. The final step in shaping the nocks is to round off these sharp edges right here where the bowstring contacts the arrow. It's not an absolutely critical step, but you'll definitely wear out your bowstrings faster if these sharp edges are here. You can see the steel tools leave little fuzzy wood fibers. So I'm gonna switch to a piece of 220 and just clean up all those little loose strands of wood. All right, the nocks are totally finished and highly refined. You know, when you're first learning to carve self nocks into wooden arrows, which is one of the more difficult parts of this process, you might have quite a few of them that you cut crooked, and that's totally fine. It just takes practice. Eventually, you know, you'll get to a point where you have a very high success rate. And as you can see, even after thousands of arrows, I still cut one crooked from time to time. Fortunately, you've left the arrows long up to this point. Just grind it off and make a new one. So there are 2 steps remaining to get these ready for fletchings, and that is to cut them to length and sand them to a finer grit so they have a nicer, smoother finish. So I've been working 8 arrow shafts up to this point when I only hope to have a finished half dozen. And I'm doing that because I anticipate culling at least 2 more of these once they're fletched up and once I've used them for the first time. And I wanted to weigh them to show you just how much variance there is, you know, when you have no control over the manufacturing process. So hopefully when I go through all the trouble of getting these fletched up and put points on them and everything, with some luck, maybe only 1 or 2 of them flies really poorly. And those will become my throwaway arrows that I take for small game that's up against rocks or something. But let's just see how much we have here in these 8 arrows for weight difference. 428. Oh, 428, look at that. 2 perfectly matched ones. 430, all right. Okay, 486. That one's a heavy one. 400, not bad. 400. 445. 400, wow. Well, that's what I get for speaking in absolutes when it comes to archery. It is definitely rare, so don't anticipate that happening with so little work. But before I get too excited, I'm gonna wait to see how these fly because the spine values are still wildly different. And there might still be a couple of outliers that fly crazy once they're fletched up and have points. But 45 grains weight variance is definitely in the ballpark for accurate shooting. So let's move over and get these sealed up. Okay, this is kind of my little sealing corner over here. My preferred sealer for bows and arrows is either Minwax tung oil or any brand of Danish oil. I really like the modern oils that penetrate deep into the wood fibers and then they harden so you get a very durable, water-resistant finish. If you're gonna seal your arrows with a natural sealer, like grease or tallow or something like that, I would not do it until after the arrows are fletched, because if you put a grease-based sealer on these arrows right now, you will completely stop any chance of your glues adhering when you go to fletch the arrows. So these modern hardening oils, they create a really nice finish, and also they still allow the fletchings to stick to the arrow shaft. It's difficult to get the oil into the nock area with a rag, so I like to use this little plastic tub here. Put enough sealer in there to cover the nocks, and then you can just take all of your arrows at the same time and dip them in there. Let that soak for just a few seconds. Once the nocks are sealed, I'll just take my bucket of oil, just apply a little bit to the arrow shafts all at once. Let that run down. And then I'm just going to roll them. This is much faster than doing it one at a time with a rag. If you find some areas that are dry, just add a little bit more oil. It doesn't take much. It's a very small amount that I'm adding here. You don't want to drip it all over the place. I mean, the floor in this area is basically 1,000 layers of oil, but if you're trying to keep your shop space nice, you definitely don't want this stuff dripping all over everything. Definitely don't get this on your clothes or your wife's rugs or anything like that. It will stain them permanently. It's kind of dark in this corner, so I can't see if the camera's focused perfectly, but a nice thin coat. Now I'm going to let this soak for a couple minutes. And I've got my old t-shirt here, and then I'll wipe off all the excess. That's it for the first of 3 coats of tung oil. And I'll just take the extra oil from the nock dipping process and put it back in the container. I'll let these dry overnight, and I'll put the second of 3 coats on first thing in the morning. That's it for this video, guys. Do not let anyone tell you that wooden dowels from the hardware store will not make perfectly serviceable arrows, so long as you are willing to navigate their quirks and accept them for what they are. But you'll find out that every arrow shaft material has its own challenges. The pros for wooden dowels are, of course, the ease of construction, the availability of the materials, and the low cost. Here are a couple of pro tips to wrap this up. First, if you want to achieve a really smooth, slick surface on your arrows, consider buffing them with like a 4/0 steel wool in between coats of oil. And the second thing is, arrows made from natural materials have to be trained to stay straight. When they're young and newly crafted, they have a tendency to warp back to their original shape. So I like to straighten them once a day while I'm building them, and then once a day for about the first week or so that you have them, and they'll be pretty well trained straight. But wooden arrows will always require periodic straightening. So it's a good habit to have, just to sight down them every once in a while and bump them straight. But for the most part, they stay pretty true. You'll see this set again in chapter 5 when we choose a fletching style for them. and put some small game points on the end. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in chapter 2, where I'm going to teach you how to make hand-planed wooden arrows from split timber using a shooting board.